Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. Thanks for dropping by. I've got another fascinating book that I want to talk about today, and that is Spider-World: The Tower by Colin Wilson, published in 1987. So this is a book that I found out in the wild when I was browsing a secondhand bookshop last year. And I'm pretty chuffed that I found this book. It's a really nice hardback, it's in pretty good condition, and it's got this amazing Chris Foss cover art, which wraps around, as you can see. This is a marvelous illustration, I think. It does a great job of capturing the essence of the premise of the story. So we've got this post-apocalyptic cityscape here, and this quite striking giant cobweb connecting these two skyscrapers. So this is a world in which giant spiders have taken over the earth. So it's a pretty intriguing premise. It's also quite a terrifying idea, I think. Certainly, if you're an arachnophobe like I am, that's pretty terrifying. So I was compelled to pick this up. It's a great one for my collection, and now I've finally got around to reading it, and I wasn't at all disappointed. So let's talk a little bit about this book. So this book takes place in a very intriguing post-apocalyptic setting. At some point in the future, a great cataclysmic collision happens between a radioactive comet and the Earth. And this has the effect of wiping out most animal life on Earth. Civilization collapses, and just a few remnants of humanity are left behind. So this is all part of the backstory. And from the time we enter this story, a lot of human knowledge and science seems to have been lost throughout the ages. And the world's ecology and wildlife have undergone some pretty radical and bizarre transformations, I guess as a result of the radioactive fallout. So bugs and insects have taken on these huge and grotesque forms. And in some cases, they've also evolved high levels of intelligence. So you've got things like giant ants, giant beetles, giant flies, and things like this. And of course, most terrifying of all, giant spiders. Some of whom actually prey on humans. So it's pretty nightmarish. Not only are these spiders incredibly dangerous, but they're also remarkably intelligent. They've even got psychic powers. So they can communicate telepathically with each other. And they have this kind of powerful mind force that they can use to control other creatures and paralyze their prey. And it's using these powers that they have become the dominant life force, and they have subjugated humans. They have colonized the remains of a large city, which serves as their capital, and where humans are their slaves. So if they're not eating us, they're enslaving us. And it's in this world that we follow a young human protagonist called Neil, who has some latent psychic abilities of his own. And he lives in a burrow in a remote desert location with his family. So unlike the city dwellers, this band of desert people, they do not belong to the enslaved class of humanity. They're one of the few sort of free people still in this world. But instead, they eke out their own modest existence that relies on hunting and gathering to acquire food. All the while avoiding dangerous predators, which tend to be these giant bugs, but most especially spiders. So this is all what's going on in the first part of this book, which is entitled The Desert, in which we follow Neil and his family and their adventures and their survival strategies in this strange world of giant insects. So it's a pretty fascinating idea, I think. There's some quite intriguing things going on. They have to learn some pretty creative and bizarre strategies in order to survive, in order to successfully hunt and gather food. So, for example, they learn to train a giant wasp to be their hunting companion. One method they use for gathering food is by milking giant aphids for their nectar, which sounds pretty disgusting, but apparently it's delicious. It sounds weird, but of course it wouldn't be weird if that's the environment you grow up in. I mean, if you think about it, it's no more weird or disturbing than drinking cow's milk, for example. But anyway, this is the first act of the book, The Desert, and it's very immersive, very compelling world building, I think. Seeing this small band of humans survive in this strange environment. There are 2 more acts that follow this section. As you can see here, so I'll just show you. Part 1, The Desert, is followed by Part 2, The Tower, and Part 3, The Fortress. And these were actually released in separate volumes, separate books, I believe for the US release. So you can actually buy these stories as 3 different books. So in a sense, this is actually the omnibus edition, I guess. So eventually, Neil and his family face a major turning point in their lives, which forces them to leave the desert behind and enter the Spider City, which is where things take off in the second act. And it's at this point in the story where it evolves from a desert survival tale into something more like a dystopian thriller. And it's here that we learn more about the nature of spider-human relations, the power that spiders have over humanity, whose rule is enabled through psychic manipulation and terror, and what life is like for people living under this regime. And while urban society does have some benefits, it has, for example, it has the advantage of agriculture, a more stable food production. Society has nevertheless regressed to a sort of pre-industrial medieval standard of living. And of course, we've got slavery of a sort. Neil has to negotiate his way through the society and live in the Spider City, and eventually he becomes an important figure, an instrumental figure in the human resistance movement. So there's a lot going on here. This is a very fast-paced story. There's a lot of intricate world building. I've only really scratched the surface here of the plot and the world, and the characters. I don't really want to give much more away, because I don't want to spoil anything. I think if you do read this book, if you do pick this up, I recommend that you don't read the blurb before reading it, because it does drop some pretty major spoilers. At least this edition does. I hate it when publishers do that, but I can definitely recommend it overall. It's a very gripping read. There's plenty of action and suspense, but there's also a fair amount of thoughtful and philosophical reflections thrown in as well. So there's a lot going on in this book. And this is also a novel that straddles multiple genres and subgenres and styles of fiction. While I would primarily classify it as science fiction, there are also a few fantasy vibes. So we've got the chosen one trope, of which Neil embodies multiple characteristics of that archetype. And we've also got the Dark Lord trope, which again you typically find in fantasy, and you see this in the character of the arachnid leader of the Spider City, who's called the Death Lord. So we've got these fantasy tropes, and we've got a sci-fi backstory, but it's also a horror novel in some respects. I mean, it's got giant man-eating spiders, so that's pretty much a horrific idea, right? So it's sci-fi, it's horror, it's fantasy. This book spans multiple identities. It's a compelling post-apocalyptic adventure. It's a wilderness survival tale. It's a meditative coming-of-age story. And it's an exciting dystopian thriller. So there's a lot going on in this novel. There's a lot going for it. And I found it very satisfying to read, very enjoyable, and exciting. It may not be a literary masterpiece on the lines of something like Hyperion or Brave New World, but I was totally engaged throughout. So this was a 5-star read for me, and it's one of my reading highlights for this year so far. I think the only thing that was perhaps a little unsatisfying is the fact that it ends on a cliffhanger and there's no real closure to this story. But it's no matter, because I have the sequel, which is called Spider-World: The Delta. So I will be diving into that soon. There are, in fact, 3 more books in this series, and I'm going to be reading them all. I can't wait to see where it goes from here. I probably won't be posting any reviews of the sequels, though. I think that would be pretty pointless, as I expect it would be hard to discuss those books without spoiling them, or at least spoiling events in the first book, because it's quite a plot-driven narrative. However, once I'm done with this whole series, I may make a series wrap-up video so I can give an overview of this whole series and my thoughts on each book. So keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, I'm taking a break between these books before studying the next one. So I've picked another book to read, and that is Other Days, Other Eyes by Bob Shaw. But that's all for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.